Everybody's missing the point. The Russia hoax, yes, but what's the hoax? The hoax is that they were concocting information. They were using information. They were using FBI investigative techniques, intelligence investigative techniques to lie about not just Russia, but to interfere with the presidential election and then to undermine the transition, and they hoped, Donald Trump's presidency. That's why I call it a silent coup. They're missing the crucial point. The crucial point is this was all done to try and prevent Donald Trump from being elected, and then to try and prevent Donald Trump from being an effective president. That was the point of my going on radio, not to prove whether or not the Russians were involved, but to demonstrate that based on the leaks, this administration, that is the Obama-Biden administration, were leaking information related to Russia, but intended to destroy the Trump campaign and then destroy his new presidency. That was the point. Well, Tulsi Gabbard, our Director of National Intelligence, as you know, she released a whole bulk of documents, and she's releasing more that have fingerprints and DNA and photos and everything else, not literally, but you get the point, on the Biden regime and what it tried to do to President Trump. And this material's out there, there will be more. And I'm guessing for many of you it's kind of confusing. So I want to break it down very generally, and then we'll get into some of the specifics. We broke this story, I did, on March 3rd, 2017 on radio. As I was doing my radio prep and I had newspapers and I had printed out stories, I started to see a pattern of leaks. And the leaks were intended to smear Donald Trump with Russia. Then I said, wait a minute, let me go back further. And I went back further prior to March 2017 when President Trump was candidate Trump. And I started to look and I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. This has been going on literally for months, these leaks. Now, as a former chief of staff to an attorney general, the FBI reports to the attorney general, as many people now know. And I could see these leaks were coming out of the Department of Justice, and they had to be coming out of the FBI, the investigative wing, effectively, of the Department of Justice. So I started to look at that, and then I started to look at more stories. And it was obvious to me that there were leaks coming out of probably the CIA, out of the intelligence apparatus of the federal government. I said, holy mackerel. And then I went further, and I saw leaks that appeared to me to be coming out of the White House. And so while I was on radio that day, I had my different stacks of stuff. I was putting it together, trying to put it in chronological order when I came on air. And I spent the next hour and a half describing to my audience, many of you, on that March 3rd, that Thursday, 2017, what I saw. What I saw based on my own experience, again, as a Justice Department top senior official. And I said, there is a silent coup taking place against the elected president of the United States. They interfered with his campaign, trying to cripple his campaign with references to Russia. I used the media. I didn't have any other information. How could I? I don't have subpoena power. I don't have the power to get a warrant from a judge. But I was looking at these public stories, and these public stories were based on planted leaks in the media. In the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in McClatchy, in other elements of the news, some better known, some not known at all. And I put it together, and so I came up with, and I was under the gun for radio, so I came up with what were basically 11 exhibits. Something like that, I think there were 11. And I laid out the case with the opening bell as the radio program began on this silent coup against President Trump. That's what I called it, as opposed to a military coup or a violent coup. Coming out of the federal bureaucracy, starting with the Obama-Biden regime, and going into president-elect period of time, and then after the inauguration, into March 3rd, 2017. Then as the show was over, the media picked up on this. Our friends at Breitbart, they did a story, they heard me. Joel Pollack, who's a great guy, he's still there. Alex Marlow, who runs the website now, he's fantastic. They did a follow-on story on what I had revealed, plus they added some information that they had compiled, and they had this headline in there about the silent coup that Levin reported on and discovered. That weekend, apparently somebody presented the president with this Breitbart article, or maybe he checked it himself, and this is when he said, my wires were tapped. The word wiretap. I used the word wiretap in my radio show. Why? Because it was literally in the headline of the New York Times story. Wiretap. Now later, the New York Times changed the headline and took out wiretap. The president was attacked for using the phrase wiretap, but he used the phrase wiretap because I used the phrase wiretap because I used it from the New York Times. Again, this wasn't investigative reporting. The investigation I did was on the public record, pulling together these different pieces. Now, what's interesting about this is that these people in the Obama-Biden regime wanted this information out. So they leaked to do damage against Trump, the campaign, transition, presidency. The media wanted to do damage against Trump. So they basically colluded with, conspired with these Obama-Biden officials, and they were feeding each other information, and they were running these stories. And so that's how I began to piece them together, because I could see what was taking place over a period of months. And it intensified after the election, and really intensified after the president was sworn in as president for his first term. Now, after I went through these things on that Thursday, after Breitbart wrote its piece, that Sunday, what would it have been, March 5th, whatever it was, March 5th or 6th, 2017, I was invited on Fox and Friends Sunday. And Pete Hegseth was obviously one of the hosts, and he interviewed me. And it went on for like 20 minutes. And they busted through their commercials. I was supposed to do like a 6-minute hit, but they wanted me to describe what I had described on my radio show. And so I had the benefit then of pulling together all the exhibits, putting them in order, and going through one after the other, after the other, after the other that Sunday morning. And at the end of the interview, or coming to the end of the interview, one of the hosts said to me, was Obama involved? Does Obama know about this? And I thought to myself, well, obviously I don't have direct evidence, but how could he not? What do you mean, Mark? How did I know about it? The public record. Of course Obama knew about it. He gets these newspapers, he gets these articles too. But even more, it's his government doing these things. We later learned about a big powwow they had in the Oval Office. Biden was there, the acting attorney general was there, Comey, the head of the FBI, was there, and some others. And of course, General Flynn got caught up in all this too, at the end of the process. And so they spent maybe 2 weeks, I'd say, Mr. Producer, trashing me, that I was coming up with conspiracy theories. Well, how could I be coming up with conspiracy theories? I'm using their reporting. And I kept saying over and over again, how is this a conspiracy theory? You wrote this, you over there, you wrote this, you over there, you reported this, you over there, you said this. I'm just putting them all together. But they couldn't chase me off. I'm like a bulldog on this stuff. I got very little support in the media in which I live, on talk radio or TV. I got very little support. Of course, at Blaze, I got total support in terms of people coming to my defense, but it didn't matter. Then eventually, some of the other hosts picked up and started running with stories and trying to track it down and so forth and so on, used a lot of the stuff we'd originally come up with. So it took off. That's how this started. So when Tulsi Gabbard, now the director of National Intel, the overarching umbrella over all of our intelligence activities, puts out this information, what happens? Well, we have some legal analysts, never Trumpers. We have some legal analysts on left-wing cable and network TV. We have the Democrats all saying, we already knew about all this Russia stuff. We already knew that Russia tried to interfere in the election, but effectively failed. We already knew all that. So move along. What's the big deal? You already knew all of what? First of all, to that point, when I was presenting this information, it was dismissed as conspiracy theory stuff. Secondly, what Gabbard has done is she's released information that shows what, in fact, the federal government under Obama and Biden were doing, in addition to what they knew. Third, that's not even the point. Everybody's missing the point. The Russia hoax, yes, but what's the hoax? The hoax is that they were concocting information. They were using information. They were using FBI investigative techniques, intelligence investigative techniques, to lie about not just Russia, but to interfere with the presidential election and then to undermine the transition, and they hoped, Donald Trump's presidency. That's why I call it a silent coup. They're missing the crucial point. The crucial point is this was all done to try and prevent Donald Trump from being elected, and then to try and prevent Donald Trump from being an effective president. And everything flew from there, the investigations, the committees, the special counsel, all that stuff. All that stuff. That was the point of my going on radio on that March 3rd, 2017. Not to prove whether or not the Russians were involved, but to demonstrate that based on the leaks, this administration, that is the Obama-Biden administration, were leaking information related to Russia, but intended to destroy the Trump campaign and then destroy his new presidency. That was the point. That still is the point. So I want to put a fine point on that.
For all this and much more, sign up for Levin TV.